Good. So let me tell you a little bit about the story of self, and then demonstrate this as a practice, and then we'll take a stretch break, and then give you the opportunity to do this in your teams. So, story of self is part of a leadership practice known as public narrative. Many of you may have done some story work before, but this is a very particular approach to story as a leadership practice. And I think has been best developed by Marshall Gans, who is at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And there are really three parts of public narrative. There's the story of self, in which you are the main character, you are the protagonist. And the story of self is really about telling a story of a time that you faced a challenge in your life, the choice that you made to address that in the face of that challenge, and the consequences or the outcomes that occurred. The story of self is really it's a leadership practice, in the sense that it is something that we can use narrative to illustrate our values, and to do that in a way that gives us some moral authority to invite others into action with us. There are two other parts of public narrative: the story of us, where the protagonist is the team, right? So it's a story of the team facing a challenge, and the way that the team dealt with that challenge and the consequences. And then there's a story of now, which we will experience. That is about what is the urgent challenge facing us, and what is possible if we actually work together effectively. We'll play a little bit with story of now in the context of doing some team purpose work. But for today, I want to introduce you to story of self, because this is an activity that we do with a lot of teams. And this is the one that I mentioned that I think helps teams both begin addressing compelling purpose from a values-based perspective, and at the same time can really build psychological safety in teams. So we use it with teams very typically at the beginning of our engagement with them, in the first time that we call the team together. Let me just be clear that everyone has many stories, and so telling a story of self really is about choosing a story that illustrates a value that is relevant to the collective work that you're about to do together. And just the other couple of things that I have up here on the slide is a little bit of advice about how to build an effective story, really around engaging the five senses and bringing people into the situation as much as you can in the way that you tell the story. So we're going to invite you to do this in groups of three in just a little while. But in order to introduce this activity, I think it's important to give you an illustration. So I'm going to tell you one of my stories of self, and then I will ask you for a little bit of feedback after, to say, when, if at all, did you connect to this story? What did you learn about the challenge, the choice, the outcome? What does it teach you about my values? And then just some suggestions for me about how I could shape this into a more effective story. So one of my public narratives. So some years ago, when I was a young professor, brand new professor at Columbia, I got some news from my family, who were across the river in New Jersey, that my mother, who had always been a really important pillar of strength in my life, had to go in for an operation. She had to go in for heart surgery and to have a triple bypass. And so I went home to be with my sisters, my team of sisters and I, to look after my mother in going through this surgery. And so we went with her to the hospital, and I can remember the first part of this challenge was just sitting in this grim pink waiting room, waiting to hear from the surgical team how my mother was doing. And the wait was just getting longer and longer and longer, far longer than we expected it to. And finally, a member of the surgical team came out and said, look, things were much worse than we expected. And in fact, she needs to have 5 bypasses rather than 3. And her heart valve is leaking. So they had to do a heart valve replacement at the same time. And so we waited together, supporting each other through many more hours of concern. And then when we went to meet with her surgeon in the recovery room afterwards, he said, listen, I have to tell you, I made an error, that because I did things in a different order than it's usually done, I accidentally wrapped a suture around the heart monitor, so we can't just take the heart monitor out. We're going to have to open her chest again tomorrow and do another surgery in order to get the heart monitor out. And you know, of course, we were terribly anxious and worried about her, but still trusting in her medical team to take care of her. And I'm sorry to say that quickly eroded, that after she had to go through a second surgery, that was the beginning of a series of errors and harms and mistakes and carelessness that just had my sisters and me becoming increasingly angry and increasingly what I think of as a team of her guardians. In fact, I like to say we looked rather like angels, but we became a group of Rottweilers around her because, for example, my sister Claire just describes what she came to call the feeding frenzy. So every time my mother was moved to a different room or to a different ward, a whole series of doctors she had never seen before would turn up and would, you know, take her blood pressure or ask us a bunch of questions, and then they would be able to bill for that service. That's what she meant by the feeding frenzy, that these doctors were coming in, doing nothing particular to care for her, not even reading the chart, but performing something, and then sending us a bill for that. One doctor was completely convinced with no evidence that she had had a stroke, when in fact she was over medicated, and that's why she was having trouble with clear thoughts and with forming words, and insisted that she needed to have a lumbar puncture. And, you know, my one sister said, "You mean a spinal tap, don't you?" And then Kathy said, "And that's really painful, isn't it?" And then Claire said, "And what is that going to tell you that you don't already know from the CT scan?" And the doctor said, "Well, nothing really." But in fact, they had just done the tests in the wrong order. So we said, "No, absolutely not." We stood like guard dogs on either side of her bed and said, "You will not do that." And yet later that night, a technician came in to wheel her away to do a lumbar puncture. And we literally stood in the doorway of this grim ICU unit to prevent them from doing this for her. And that led for me into a really dark and really angry night, in which I remember, I was on guard duty on my own that night. And I remember sitting by her bed as she was sleeping and smelling the alcohol in the air and listening to the breathing machines around me and hearing the little beeps, and really caught up in my anger on her behalf, and how little caretaking and care and safety we felt in this place that was supposed to be a place of caregivers. And I remember sitting there and saying, what am I going to do with this anger? I mean, I'm not helpless here. I can do something about this. I am a professor. I am an excellent writer. I can use my bully pulpit to say what I am seeing in this system, the ways in which these people who are supposed to be caring for my mother are actually just looking after their own interests and not even bothering to learn who this person is or what's going on with her before doing some kind of treatment or test and then billing her for it. And so I remember even starting to craft sentences of what was going on, what was going to go into this highly critical article aimed at taking apart our healthcare system. And I also remember looking around at the windows of all of the other rooms in this intensive care unit and seeing these other patients there in the middle of the night who don't have an angry team of daughters to look after them. And I sat there and I started writing my sentences, and I realized that this just wasn't sitting well with me. And so I had to take a breath and I had to sit back. And I realized that writing an angry critical article was not what I was meant to do. It was not me. That I actually understand, because of my education in organizational behavior, because of the path that I've taken in my study, because of my interest in understanding what calls people in their work and how people stay connected to their sense of accomplishment and calling, I knew that what I was looking at were doctors who were living in a sick system, that they were people who had gotten into the work that they were doing from a sense of calling. and that they found themselves in a system in which the way they are managed, the way they are rewarded, what is asked of them, systematically erodes their ability to work from a sense of calling and a sense of intrinsic motivation. And I realized that I couldn't call them out for it, that they and my mother and the families around us were all victims of a very badly and sickly designed system. And so I made the choice to figure out not how I could break down, but how I could actually help. And so over the course of the years, I became involved ultimately in a group that is called Rethink Health. And the work that I do with Rethink Health is about supporting leaders who want to come together to do something truly transformative, to redesign a system that actually works for us all, and that supports and enables the well-being, not just of patients and of their families, but also of the caregivers and providers who do this work as well. And I also am happy and proud to say that one of the things that I got to do a few years ago now was to help build a program in that very health system where my mother was so my mother and those families were so poorly served, to build a leadership program that really brings together doctors and payers and hospitals to begin transformative work to redesign the healthcare system of which they were a part. So that is one of my stories of self. And so let me just ask you a few questions about that story and what you heard. First, starting with when in that story did you connect to it, if at all? What were the moments when you found yourself connecting to it or relating to it, and why?
I can speak. So when you describe standing guard at the bed, felt very personal to me because I had a similar experience with my father. So automatically could place myself with.
Right. So you could you have a parent, you have been their caregiver, you could relate to that moment of feeling
Correct.
like you're responsible for guarding. Thank you.
I would say for me it was just the defining the element of your mother getting very, very sick and you receiving the news. I think that was, for me, made me sit up and think, well, this is going to be a real story. It's going to be a compelling story. It's going to be an emotional story. There'll be lots to digest. And so I think that for me was right on, very early on.
So
like, this is a real life experience that you're willing to share.
Yes.
So let's go.
Great. Thank you.
I would say that I also had the mother story and sisters, but we only, of the three sisters, only two of us participated. So that was kind of frustrating. So I connected with your story immediately.
Yeah.
What I found most powerful is the lessons that you, quote unquote, embraced yourself in the moment of anger and how to turn that into something for good. I don't think we ever got there. We just lived in the frustrated process.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So let me pursue that thought, Freddie. And the rest of you, in the story that I told, did you hear a clear challenge, a clear choice, and a clear outcome? And what did you learn about my values, if anything, from the story that I told?
Well, I think that you were true to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You knew.
Are a change agent.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. How can you fix a broken system? How can you help to rebuild a broken system?
Great.
And
thank you.
I feel that actually you discovered the whole situation as an opportunity for improvement. You just got a grip and you controlled yourself, and it was just through this self-management that you were able to discover an opportunity for improvement and for just enhancing the well-being and the whole system.
Yeah, I certainly didn't start there. That's not how I came into the experience.
Yeah, I appreciated the reflection, like you showed your reactionary way and kind of using your tools as a scholar to kind of problem solve or solution jump, but then you evolved and kind of reflected and see how you could, I guess, be more transformative on a larger sustainable scale.
Great. So
Yeah,
thank you.
and I also recognize a little bit of your test and learn, because it wasn't just an intellectual process.
Right.
You really sat down and started to writing. And it was during that process that you really understood and find your real values. That was, I got out of it.
Thank
There's
you.
something for me about compassion as well, of the choice not to punish and break down, as you said, but to understand that the behavior of others, the doctors in particular, was driven by a wider system.